Picture this. It's the dead of winter in 1975, and you are in a rock band. You're driving across North America in this rented, freezing station wagon, hauling your gear through the snow to play in these half-empty high school gyms.
Oh, man. Yeah, just the absolute literal definition of paying your dues.
Right. And you're deeply, profoundly in debt. Your latest album just completely tanked, and your record label is explicitly threatening to pull the plug on your entire career.
Which is terrifying for any artist.
Completely. So what do? Do you sell out and give the corporate suits the commercial pop hits they're demanding? Or do you double down on exactly the kind of strange, sprawling music that got you into this mess in the first place?
Well, it's the ultimate creative crossroads. It's the kind of immense pressure that usually just fractures a band completely. But occasionally, under the right conditions, it forces them to forge a masterpiece out of just, sheer desperation.
And spoiler alert, they chose the masterpiece. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Rush's 1976 album, 2112. We have a massive stack of sources to pull from today.
Yeah, we've got historical chart data, some deep musicological analyses, meticulous studio notes, and some really fascinating cultural retrospectives, too.
We do. And our mission today is to explore how the ultimate act of artistic defiance not only saved this Canadian trio from total bankruptcy, but also, accidentally birthed the entire progressive metal genre.
Okay.
Let's unpack this.
So to really grasp the gravity of 2112, we have to understand the absolute crisis that preceded it. By late 1975, Rush had released their third album, Caress of Steel.
This was a pretty wild record, right?
Oh, yeah. It was this sprawling, experimental record filled with massive progressive rock epics, and commercially, it was just an unmitigated disaster. It sold a dismal 40,000 copies in their home country of Canada.
Wow, that is low.
Yeah, and the supporting tour was so poorly attended that the band and the road crew actually started internally referring to it as the Down the Tubes tour.
Oh, that is incredibly bleak. And naturally, Mercury Records, their label, was furious about this. The sources show the executives absolutely hated these long, progressive epics.
They really did. They wanted 3-minute, radio-friendly, hard rock hits. Basically, they wanted a repeat of Rush's Zeppelin-influenced debut album from a few years prior.
It reminds me of a struggling tech startup being told by their venture capitalists, look, pivot to this boring, safe, proven product right now, or we're cutting off your funding.
That's a really solid analogy, but let's escalate it a bit. Imagine those venture capitalists hold the keys to whether your company even exists tomorrow. The tension between risk-mitigating standardization and pure artistic autonomy was just at a boiling point.
Right, the stakes couldn't be higher.
Exactly. The corporate pressure was so intense that their manager, Ray Daniels, actually flew all the way to Mercury's headquarters in Chicago with a single goal to beg them to exercise their option for a fourth album.
Just to keep them afloat.
Yep. And to get that commitment, Daniels outright lied to the label executives. He promised them that the band had, learned their lesson and was returning to a straightforward, highly commercial rock format.
Which just blows my mind.
No.
He's sitting there smiling in a Chicago boardroom, promising radio hits, while back in Toronto, Geddy Lee, Alex Lifeson, and Neil Peart were doing the exact opposite.
Complete opposite.
They were so fiercely protective of their vision that they actually banned their own management from the creative process. They made this collective pact that if they were going to lose their recording career, they were going to go down in flames on their own terms.
Which takes some serious guts. They refused to let anyone from the label or management hear a single note of the material until the recording was entirely finished.
Right.
Now, this brings up a persistent industry legend that our sources actually take time to clarify. You'll often hear this dramatic story that Mercury issued a formal, written, legal ultimatum to drop the band before they even recorded 2112.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that one. Sign on the dotted line or you're fired.
Right, but our sources confirm that's actually a myth. Rush had a specific type of production deal that granted them complete creative control over their master recordings.
Oh, I see. So Mercury couldn't, legally march into the studio and stop them from making a weird prog album.
Precisely. The real threat was much colder than that. Mercury could simply receive the finished album and just refuse to promote it, or they could drop them immediately afterward by not picking up future options.
Jeez.
Yeah, so the financial doom was very real, but the creative control was technically theirs to lose.
Okay, so armed with that creative autonomy, they walk into the studio, and instead of recording those 3-minute pop songs, they dedicate the entire first side of the vinyl record, 20 minutes and 34 seconds, to be exact, to a 7-part dystopian sci-fi suite.
A massive undertaking.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second, because when you hear, 20-minute sci-fi rock suite, it's really easy to just roll your eyes. Is this just peak 1970s progressive rock self-indulgence? Does this massive, unwieldy structure actually serve a purpose for the listener?
Well, it absolutely serves a purpose. What's so fascinating here is how the musical architecture isn't just them showing off, it perfectly mirrors the narrative plot.
How so?
The story follows this unnamed protagonist who is crushed by a collectivist, authoritarian state called Megadon, which is ruled by the priests of the temples of Syrinx. And the band uses the actual mechanics of music, the time signatures, instrumentation, vocal registers to dramatize this clash of ideologies.
Oh, that's really cool. Let's actually dig into those mechanics then. The suite opens with this massive instrumental movement called the overture.
Yeah, the overture sets the scene with these cold, sweeping synthesizer voids. They created these using an instrument called an ARP Odyssey.
Right, one of those early analog synths?
Exactly. It produces very alien mechanical tones, and those tones fade into a really heady guitar riff played in an asymmetric 7/4 time signature.
Okay, wait, pause. I don't read sheet music. What does a 7/4 time signature actually feel like to the listener?
Good question. Think about most rock or pop music you hear on the radio today. It's almost always in 4/4 time. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right, super standard.
Yeah, you can tap your foot to it. It mimics a steady walking pace or a heartbeat. But 7/4 time lops off a beat at the end. It's an uneven cycle.
So it throws you off.
Exactly. So instead of a steady walk, your brain constantly feels like it's falling forward. It creates a real sense of urgency, instability, and tension.
Oh, it's like trying to run down the stairs in the dark and missing a step at the bottom. It just throws you off balance.
That is a perfect way to describe it. And over that off-balance rhythm, the guitar plays an homage to Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture.
Wait, Tchaikovsky, the classical composer. Why borrow from that specific piece for a rock album?
Because the 1812 overture was famously written to commemorate Russia's defense against Napoleon's invasion. I mean, Tchaikovsky literally wrote parts for real cannons to be fired during the performance.
Oh, right, the cannons.
Yeah. It is the ultimate historical soundtrack to defending your homeland against an overwhelming oppressive force. So Rush is borrowing that historical weight to foreshadow the revolution in their own sci-fi story.
That is incredibly clever. But then we hit the second movement, the Temples of Syrinx, and the music sharply shifts. We drop the weird time signatures and lock into a rigid, hard-driving 4/4 heavy metal meter.
Yes, very rigid.
And this is where Geddy Lee's vocals enter. But he is singing in this extreme, shrill, almost terrifyingly high-register screech.
And that harshness is entirely intentional. That abrasive, unrelenting heavy metal represents the cold, computerized oppression of the priests. They are the ultimate authority, enforcing conformity, you know?
Right, so the music feels appropriately monolithic and rigid to match their control over everything.
Precisely. But then we arrive at the third movement, Discovery, and the contrast is just breathtaking. The heavy electric instruments completely vanish.
And we hear, like, the ambient sound of running water in a cave, right?
Yes. And this is where our protagonist finds an ancient, forgotten instrument, a guitar.
And musically, Alex Lifeson mimics the process of someone intuitively learning to play an instrument for the very first time. The notes mention he uses a borrowed Fender Stratocaster to play these gentle, tentative acoustic arpeggios.
Yeah, he's literally discovering the notes,
Yeah.
and Geddy Lee drops his vocal register down to a warm, natural, vulnerable baritone.
It's so different from the shrieking.
Exactly. The acoustic guitar here represents pure, individual human creativity, standing in stark opposition to the distorted electric conformity of the priests.
It's like a caveman discovering fire, but, with melody. And that leads directly into the confrontation, the fourth movement, which is presentation.
Right, where he brings the guitar to them.
Yeah, the protagonist brings this beautiful acoustic guitar to the priests, thinking they'll be thrilled by the discovery. And the music literally stages a physical fight. It's a call and response.
It really is.
When the protagonist pleads his case, we hear those gentle acoustic chords. But when the priests reject him, the band violently stomps on the distortion pedals, and Geddy Lee goes right back into those high-pitched, tyrannical shrieks.
It's a sonic battle of ideologies playing out right there through the speakers. And sadly, the protagonist loses. The priests violently destroy the guitar.
Which is just heartbreaking.
It is. This sends the protagonist into absolute despair in the soliloquy movement, which is highlighted by this incredibly emotional, crying, blues-infused guitar solo from Lifeson. It ultimately ends with the protagonist taking his own life because he just can't endure a world without art.
Man, that's heavy. And that brings us to the grand finale, which is a chaotic, instrumental tour de force back in that unstable 7/4 time that simulates a massive interstellar war.
Yeah, the tension just explodes.
And then, out of nowhere, the heavy music drops out completely, and you hear this chilling, robotic, spoken word voice dripping with delay effect saying, "Attention all planets of the Solar Federation. We have assumed control." It literally gives you goosebumps just thinking about it.
It really is a masterful integration of narrative and sound.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for anyone who cares about how records are actually made. Because there's a big myth floating around that they recorded this massive, dense epic on incredibly primitive 8-track equipment in someone's basement.
Oh yeah, we can definitely put that myth to rest. While their earlier albums certainly had technical limitations, our sources show that by February 1976, they were at Toronto Sound Studios with producer Terry Brown.
So they weren't roughing it.
Not at all. They were utilizing a state-of-the-art 24-track Studer tape machine and a custom Neve mixing console.
Wow, okay, so they had the absolute best toys available at the time. But what's wild is that they didn't overdo it with all that tech.
That was the genius of it. Despite having 24 tracks to layer sound upon sound, Terry Brown deliberately minimized the overdubs. They really wanted to capture a band in a room live energy.
They wanted to feel real.
Exactly. They wanted the listener to feel the physical power of a trio just playing together in real time.
The way they engineered the individual instruments to sound that big without layering is just wild. Take Alex Lifeson's guitars. The sources explain that they took a tape delay unit, which creates an echo effect, and ran it directly into his Marshall amplifier.
Which is crucial because normally you add a clean delay effect at the mixing board after the amplifier.
Right, to keep it pristine.
Exactly. But by running it directly into the amp, those delay repeats were physically pushed through the hot power tubes. This naturally compressed the echoes and gave them this gritty, saturated bite.
So instead of a clean echo, like, shouting into the Grand Canyon, it's like shouting into a jet engine. The sound breaks down, it gets violent and frantic.
It gets so aggressive.
It makes the machinery of the dystopian story feel like it's literally malfunctioning in your ears.
Exactly. It's an emotional texture, not just a cool technical trick. And Terry Brown's approach to Geddy Lee's bass was equally inventive.
What did he do there?
Well, Lee played a Rickenbacker 4001 bass, which uniquely has a stereo output. It can actually send two separate signals. So Brown split that signal. He took one half the clean, low-end foundation and ran it directly into the recording console with heavy compression to keep it really punchy and defined.
Okay, so that's the clean part. What about the other half?
The other half was sent out to an electro voice speaker that was pushed to its absolute physical limit until the speaker itself distorted. That created this harsh metallic bite on top.
I love the notes on this. It's like blending oil and water to create a completely new substance. You get the deep, clean foundation that you can feel in your chest, paired with the nasty teeth of the distortion that just cuts through the mix.
It's brilliant. And then there's Neil's drum kit.
Let's hear it.
Peart used a massive multi-mic'd Slingerland kit, but his secret weapon was a custom process called Vibro-Fibing. The wooden interiors of his drum shells were actually treated with a thin layer of fiberglass.
So they basically paved the inside of the drums. Why does that matter?
Because raw wood absorbs sound and creates sort of muddy overtones, the fiberglass hardened the interior, bouncing the sound waves back almost immediately.
Oh, so it makes it snappier.
Exactly. This focused the attack of every single drum hit, allowing the drums to cut through that incredibly dense, heavy mix of distorted bass and guitar with surgical precision.
That is just incredible. So that's side a sonic, perfectly engineered masterpiece of rebellion. But I imagine a listener in 1976 sitting in their basement completely exhausted after that 20-minute assault.
Oh, for sure.
Where do you even go from there? You literally have to flip the vinyl over, and side B is, well, it's completely different. Why would a band put a heavy, philosophical sci-fi epic on one side of a record and then open the other side with a lighthearted, tongue-in-cheek song about cannabis tourism?
It definitely seems jarring to modern ears, but that physical flip of the vinyl was a crucial strategy back then. Rush had learned from their previous album that stretching one heavy concept across too much space just exhausted the listener's stamina.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, side B was their chance to clear the palette and prove they were sophisticated songwriters capable of brevity and diverse styles.
And they nailed it.
Yeah.
Because that Cannabis track, A Passage to Bangkok, is just a great standalone rock song. It features this overdriven, Led Zeppelin-inspired twist on the classic 1847 Oriental riff.
Yeah.
That stereotypical Asian melody you hear in old movies, but played with serious swagger.
Yeah, it's very tongue-in-cheek.
And then you have Tears, which is this beautiful, melancholic ballad written by Geddy Lee.
Tears is actually historically significant for the band, too. It marks the very first time Rush ever featured an outside guest musician on a recording.
Really? Who was it?
Hugh Syme, who was actually the band's graphic artist. He contributed this lush, multi-tracked Mellotrons string arrangement to the song.
For those who might not know, a Mellotron is essentially a 1970s analog sampler, right? It uses a keyboard to trigger physical loops of magnetic tape that have real violins or choirs recorded on them.
Exactly. It gives it this eerie, haunting quality.
And wait, the graphic artist just jumped on the keyboards.
He did. Hugh Syme was a serious multi-talent. And then the album closes with a song called Something for Nothing. The backstory here is great. Neil was apparently driving in downtown Los Angeles and saw a piece of graffiti sprayed on a wall that just said, "Freedom isn't free."
And that single phrase sparked the entire lyrical theme for the track. Alex Lifeson later confirmed that Something for Nothing is meant to act as the philosophical coda to the entire album.
It really ties it all together.
Yeah. If side A is a tragic story about the suppression of individual creativity, the final track on side B is a direct call to action for the listener. It's an anthem saying that freedom and achievement require your conscious effort and willpower. You can't just wait for a savior to fix things for you.
Beautifully put. And, speaking of Hugh Syme, his contribution goes far beyond just playing the Mellotron on Tears. He designed the famous cover art and the iconic Starman logo that debuted on this album.
Oh, the naked man standing defensively against a massive glowing red star.
That's the one.
We have to talk about that logo, because over the years, I've heard some incredibly wild conspiracies about it.
Oh, there was a genuine moral panic about it at the time. For decades, rumor mills tried to link the logo to the occult, claiming it was a satanic pentagram.
Right, the Satanic Panic era stuff.
Exactly. But our sources firmly debunk this. First of all, musically and visually, it's just a geometric misunderstanding. It's not a pentagram. The inner lines of the star do not cross.
Okay, good point.
Second, the entire conceptual framing of the image places the man in direct opposition to the star.
He's defending himself against it. He's not worshiping it.
Precisely. Syme designed the naked man to represent pure, stripped-down human creativity and individuality, completely free from societal trappings. The red star represents the Solar Federation from the sci-fi story, which is a symbol of oppressive collectivism and state-mandated uniformity.
Which brings us right into the philosophical minefield of this album. Because in the liner notes, Rush decided to dedicate the album to, quote, the genius of Ayn Rand.
Yes, they did.
And her 1938 novella, Anthem, heavily inspired the plot of the title suite. In her book, a protagonist living in a collectivist dystopia finds a lost piece of technology, a light bulb. On the album, he finds a guitar.
The parallels are definitely there.
But hang on, it's the mid-1970s? Punk rock is brewing. Why on earth would you dedicate your album to Ayn Rand? They had to know that was throwing a match into gasoline.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it absolutely was a match in gasoline, and it sparked a massive critical controversy. Her philosophy of objectivism, which at its core champions rational self-interest and extreme individualism while rejecting altruism, was incredibly polarizing.
I can imagine.
Yeah, the British music press, particularly a journalist named Barry Miles writing for the NME, launched blistering attacks on the band. He went so far as to label them neo-fascists because of Rand's association with right-wing laissez-faire capitalism.
Which is just a staggering accusation. And our sources show that label deeply, deeply wounded the band, especially Geddy Lee.
It was very personal for him.
Both of his parents were survivors of the Holocaust. They survived Auschwitz and Dachau.
Yeah.
So to have a music journalist casually call a Jewish child of Holocaust survivors a neo-fascist was just incredibly offensive and, quite frankly, historically blind.
It was a profound misreading of the text and the individuals involved, but, to be totally clear with you listening, we are not taking sides here. Our goal is to impartially report on the source material.
Absolutely. We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the sources show the imagery of 2112 has actually been claimed by entirely opposing political viewpoints over the last few decades.
It's like a lyrical Rorschach test. We're just laying out the interpretations here. But on the left-wing or anti-corporate side, listeners view the Solar Federation as a metaphor for the rigid, automated systems of corporate capitalism.
Right.
The priests represent greedy record label executives who demand standardization and treat art as a commodified, mass-produced product, which, ironically, is literally the battle the band was fighting behind the scenes with Mercury Records.
It fits perfectly. Meanwhile, from a right-wing or anti-socialist perspective, listeners view the red star as a clear symbol of state-mandated socialism and collectivism, where a centralized government suppresses individual achievement in the name of forced, absolute equality.
It's wild that one single album can serve as an anthem for both ideological camps. And it's also really worth noting that Neil Peart's own views evolved significantly over his life. He didn't remain locked into the mindset of a 23-year-old.
No, he didn't.
He actually later distanced himself from Ayn Rand's strict objectivism.
He did. He explained that his intense interest in Rand during his early 20s was really just a defense mechanism. It was a reaction to the cynicism, control, and exploitation he faced in the music industry.
That makes a lot of sense, honestly.
Yeah, her intense focus on self-reliance really helped him protect his artistic integrity when the label was breathing down his neck. But as he matured, he explicitly rejected the cold, compassionless implications of her philosophy.
He changed his tune entirely.
Yeah, he famously redefined his mature political outlook later in life as a, quote, bleeding heart libertarian. He maintained his belief in individual freedom, certainly, but he also stressed the fundamental necessity of human empathy and strong social safety nets.
So what does this all mean? We have this band on the brink of bankruptcy. They stick to their guns. They make this heavy, philosophical, structurally complex 20-minute suite. They put it out into the world with a giant target on their backs. And what happened?
Against all industry logic and expectations, they won.
Wow.
Yeah. 2112 hit number 61 on the U.S. Billboard 200 chart, which was an unprecedented breakthrough for them at the time. It went on to achieve triple platinum status, selling millions of copies purely through grassroots word of mouth and just relentless, exhausting touring.
It proved to the record label, and really the entire music industry, that uncompromising artistic integrity could actually be commercially viable. You don't always have to play it safe to survive.
And that is the ultimate legacy of 2112. By calling the label's bluff and refusing to flinch, Rush secured absolute creative autonomy for themselves for the next 40 years. Mercury Records never interfered with their conceptual ambitions ever again.
That is a massive victory.
It really is. And in doing so, Rush effectively laid the architectural blueprint for the entire progressive metal genre. They directly influenced massive bands like Dream Theater, Tool, and countless others who realized, hey, you could blend heavy metal aggression with complex narrative structures.
They risked absolutely everything on a single roll of the dice, and it paid off. But before we wrap up today, there's one more layer to this that we really need to sit with. This raises an important question about the very end of the title suite.
Okay, where are we going with this?
You remember that robotic, delayed voice that closes out the interstellar war? Attention all planets of the Solar Federation. We have assumed control.
Right, the grand finale, the culmination of all that tension.
Right. Now, Neil Peart originally envisioned that as a happy ending. His intention in the lyrics was that the elder race of creative, free-thinking humans had finally returned from deep space to overthrow the priests of Syrinx and liberate the planet.
However, as our sources point out, there is a much darker, much more ambiguous interpretation of that ending that has resonated with fans for decades.
Tell me about it.
Well, because when you hear a cold, synthesized, disembodied voice booming, we have assumed control over and over again. It doesn't exactly sound like freedom. It sounds like the inauguration of a brand new regime.
Exactly. It forces you to think about the cyclical nature of history. How often does a revolution happen? The old oppressive structures are violently torn down by the so-called liberators, and yet the people on the ground don't actually end up free.
Yeah, the uniforms change, the slogans change, but the authority remains.
They just end up under new management.
It's a chilling thought. Even when the old structures of control are destroyed, the vacuum of power is incredibly dangerous. It is often filled by something equally rigid, just wrapped in a different flag.
So as you go about your day, think back to those three guys in that freezing station wagon in 1975. They fought the corporate system. They won their artistic freedom. But they left us with that haunting, unresolved question hidden at the end of their masterpiece. When the dust settles on the revolution and liberators take charge, are we truly free? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care.